Good evening. Before we get started, let me go ahead and pray. Father, I just pray for this time, Lord, that you would bless us as we study your word, even at different times and in different places. Lord, we know that your word speaks through many languages to all of us, Father. So we just pray that you would bless our study, help us to see things that we haven't seen before, and to know you more as a result. We pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen. So this is my first attempt using OBS project, so we'll see how it goes. But I decided to title this presentation, or this passage, Decree of Judgment. And I recognize that that title would work fairly well for probably most passages in Hosea, at least a lot of them, but I didn't really know how else to name this passage, so this is what I went with. But the way we'll go through this is we'll do translation, and then I've got a few kind of general comments for the whole passage, and then we'll go verse by verse, as is the pattern in all of our presentations, and then we'll wrap it up at the end. So here's my translation. A trumpet to the palate. It is like an eagle over the house of Yahweh. For they have passed over my covenant, and against my law they have rebelled. They will cry out to me, My God, we Israel know you. Israel has rejected good. An enemy will pursue him. They have made kings, but not because of me. They have made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. They have made their silver and their gold to be idols for themselves, so that he will be destroyed. He has rejected your calf, Samaria. My anger is kindled at them. How long will they be unable to be free from guilt? For it is from Israel, and a craftsman himself made it, but it is not God. For it will be in pieces, this calf of Samaria. For they will sow in the wind, and they will reap in the whirlwind. He will have no standing grain. What sprouts will not produce flour. If it does produce it, strangers will swallow it. So before we begin, I have a few comments on text criticism, especially as it applies to this passage. I wrote that you'll notice a proclivity towards the MT, and I think I actually went with the Masoretic in every single option. So that wasn't intentional, but it's kind of how it happened, and there's kind of two reasons this tends to happen for me. One is just a theological understanding that God has revealed his word completely in the manuscripts that we already have, and maybe we take that for granted, but I think it actually bears on textual criticism a lot and the decisions that you make. And then the second is a little bit more abstract, but it's kind of just a general epistemological commitment not to change my mind unless a sufficient body of evidence is presented. So, in other words, there might be some great suggestions, but if there's no evidence, then I'm just honestly not going to bother with it. And you'll see that come out quite a bit. And then another comment, I just believe that inerrancy extends only to the consonants, and this is something that needs to be qualified a little bit, but what this implies is that I'm going to be much more interested in revocalization-based arguments than anything else. So just keep those things in mind as you see how I do, or maybe, depending on your opinion, don't do text criticism. And then some general grammar and syntax comments. There's some very interesting things in this passage. One of the things I was most surprised by is that the verb location in these clauses, there's 27 clauses, I think, if you go with the way that the Masoretic text has split it up, and 23 of them are not verb initial. So that's just something very interesting. That's not what I would have expected. My default understanding is that a Hebrew clause will be verb initial, or at least will be the verb will come before the subject, but not really the case in this passage. And then the PC and the SC, or the prefix conjugation and suffix conjugation verbs, that's just the terminology I use for what some people would call perfect, or in this order, imperfect and perfect, or what some people would call yiktol and katal. PC and SC is just the most compact way to do it, especially for parsing, so that's what I go with. PC, prefix conjugation, that's the yod. SC, suffix conjugation. So these follow a fairly definable pattern in these verses, which is not really what we've seen in a lot of Hosea. Almost every single PC verb has the semantic force of like an impending action. It doesn't really seem that far off. It seems like it's coming soon, but it's in the future. And then for the SC verbs, it seems to be that like the idea of a completed action. And then the third thing to keep in mind is that there's some back and forth with the suffixes. And again, this also fits what we've seen in Hosea up to this point, where there's a second, and there's a third, and then there's a singular, and there's a plural. So here it seems to be back and forth mostly between the singular and the plural. And so my default is to take the singular to refer to Israel and the plural to refer to Israelites. I just think that for most of the clauses is the simplest way to explain the data. So Anderson Friedman has this good quote on page 483. The speech in 8:1 through 8 and in what follows gives the impression of viewing Israel somewhat from a distance. So the impression that I get here is that Yahweh is the one speaking for the most part. There may be one clause where Hosea is speaking, but for the most part, Yahweh is the one speaking. And it's almost like he's standing far off away from Israel, observing their behavior and decreeing judgments as a result of their behavior. Not really much of a dialogue with Israel. So that also fits what we've seen in a lot of Hosea. So let's go verse by verse now. So, verse 1, here's my translation again. A trumpet to the palate. It is like an eagle over the house of Yahweh, for they have passed over my covenant, and against my law they have rebelled. Now this verse is quite strange. And by the way, if you want me to read Hebrew in the next presentation, just let me know and I will, but my default is not going to assault your ears with that. But this is a very strange verse, and it's not really clear at first glance or at second or third glance what it means. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it and reading about it, and there's some interesting things to work through. But first, let's take a look at the verbs. So the first verb, the avru, that is a kal suffix conjugation, or katal or perfect if you're using that way of talking about the verbs. Kal suffix conjugation, third common plural from avar. And then pashu is a kal suffix conjugation, third common plural from pasha. So these are fairly simple. And now text critical issues. It'll be helpful to have your BHS open throughout the course of this presentation. And what I've tried to do is make the text critical issues, the way I've notated them on the slides, the same as the way you would look them up in BHS. So let's look at A. The critical apparatus is saying, I believe this is what it's saying at least, that a line break has dropped out. I think that's what that stitch means. However, they don't seem to really present any evidence, so we're just going to go ahead and reject that one. And then for B, there's several different proposals that the critical apparatus provides. For example, a lie, or maybe there's a verb that's dropped out. That's one of the things it says. Oh, excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong verse. Right. So this one proposal, kanotzer or kashomer. So there's some different proposals. So kanotzer, like one who watches. Kashomer, like one who guards. In context, it kind of makes sense. This is, again, instead of the first word in that second clause, that kanesher. But there's really no evidence given, and it's just an attempt to make this verse easier to understand. So we're going to go ahead and reject that one as well. Now, for grammar and syntax on this verse, these first two clauses are far and away the most difficult. The third clause and the fourth clause are more straightforward. But I think it's probably a little bit easier if we insert a copulative jussive. So, let there be a trumpet to the lips, like an eagle over the house of Yahweh. That might be an option. But again, it still doesn't really, it's not clear what's being said here. So Anderson Friedman actually says, this verse is enigmatic. And I find that to be a funny understatement, that it's enigmatic. Now, if we look at it on a clausal level, interestingly enough, the final two clauses are quite symmetrical, actually. So you can see that in the highlighted verbs. You got, they have passed over, or they have gone over my covenant, and against my law, or against my Torah, they have rebelled. So if you look at, you can see the verb, and then the object, and then well, it's really a prepositional phrase in that fourth clause, and then you get the verb at the end. So I don't know if I would necessarily call it chiasmus, but it's definitely good, forceful rhetoric, and maybe we could see some parallelism there. So let's ask some interpretive questions. Why the palate and not the lips? That's a good question. Why the shofar? Maybe that's one of the easier ones. And why the eagle? That's probably the hardest one. So as for the first one, the palate and not the lips, Anderson Friedman has an interesting point here. The Targum made a sensible paraphrase which recognized that the palate was sometimes mentioned as an organ of speech. It attached the qaf to shofar to make another simile. Speak with your palate like a horn. So the way Anderson and Friedman are reading this, it's actually a command, presumably to Hosea. And we'll come back to that in a second. Now, why the shofar? Well, Hosea 5:8 also includes the shofar, and if you remember, that was from, I think, 3 presentations back, and it's this idea of a warning for a coming disaster. So it's an urgent need. Someone needs to go blow the shofar or blow the horn. Now, what about the eagle? So there's several different ideas for how we solve this. Dwayne Garrett has probably the most interesting one. And he says the eagle is actually a vulture, which that's not that big a deal because it's in the semantic range. And the main point is a note of urgency akin to what a priest would have if a vulture landed on the house of Yahweh. I find this very interesting. Maybe a little bit of a stretch, but Garrett talks about it in the New American Commentary. And he's basically saying, like, okay, so a vulture is an unclean animal. If an unclean animal landed on the temple, that's what he's understanding the house of Yahweh to be. What would a priest do if an unclean animal like that landed on the temple of Yahweh? Well, surely he would blow the horn, try to scare it away with a sense of urgency. This is a holy house. This is an unclean animal. So what Garrett's saying is it's essentially a command to blow the shofar with the same kind of urgency, to sound a warning with the same kind of urgency that the priest would have in trying to scare the vulture off the roof of the temple. The second suggestion is the eagle is a bird of prey to the Israelites. In other words, it's a negative symbol, and it's representing an invading army. So Mackintosh says this, and some other people say it as well, but they look at several different verses where this eagle is used as an image for an invading army. And then Anderson Friedman take that same idea and actually go a step further with it. And they don't say it's representing an invading army, but it's actually representing Yahweh himself. And these two ideas, by the way, are not really in conflict with each other. You could actually take both 2 and 3 together, I think. But Anderson Friedman point to 32:11 in Deuteronomy, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the verse that says that Yahweh will protect his people like an eagle. So it's essentially what Anderson and Friedman are saying is that this positive thing in Deuteronomy has now flipped on its head, and it's a negative thing in Hosea. Again, this would fit a lot of what we've seen in Hosea. I think it's a very sensible solution. And I think 2 and 3 actually go together because we know that in the course of Israel's history, Yahweh uses invading armies to come and enact the punishment. So both of these would fit very nicely, I think. And then if we think back to what was suggested by Anderson Friedman about this idea of the palate, if he's correct, or if they're correct, I should say, then this is actually a warning to Hosea to warn the people. It's a command to Hosea to warn the people about the fact that Yahweh is now going to come after them like an eagle with an invading army. And so, again, this would fit some themes that we've seen throughout the prophets. Not necessarily so much in Hosea, but if you think to Ezekiel especially, there's this several chapter dialogue between God and Hosea, and Ezekiel, where he basically says, I'm going to tell you to warn the people, and if you warn someone and they don't listen, then their blood's on them. But if you warn someone or if you don't warn someone and then they don't listen, well, the blood's actually on you as the prophet, because I told you to warn them and you didn't warn them. So this would fit the prophets. The prophets were sent to declare a message of repentance, to warn the Israelites of the coming disaster that was as a result of their sin. So let's move on to verse 2. Translation, they will cry out to me, my God, we, Israel, know you. Now, that would point back to the Israelites, and you can see it in the part that I have in quotation marks as well. We, Israel, know you. So we've got some verbs here. The first verb is yizaku, and that's a kal prefix conjugation, third masculine plural from za'ak. And this fits the pattern that we talked about earlier with prefix conjugations being something that's happening in the future, probably closer rather than farther, but that's kind of a matter of interpretation. And the second verb is that verb yada'anu ka, and that's a kal suffix conjugation, first common plural with a second masculine singular suffix from yada. Okay, so there's a couple of text critical issues to work through here on verse 2. The first is a suggestion that maybe there's a different prepositional phrase in that first clause. So if you look at verse 2, you'll see the little A mark, and you go down to the critical apparatus, they say, well, maybe it's Eli instead of Li. Maybe, but there's no evidence, so we're going to reject that one. And then they also suggest that maybe a verb has dropped out, and again, no evidence, so we'll reject that one. So for part B, we see first there's a suggestion perhaps the word order swapped, but there's no evidence for that, so we're going to reject that as well. Second, this is really an interesting suggestion. The Syriac and the Old Greek do not include Israel or a possessive pronoun. So, you can kind of see the Masoretic is more awkward grammatically, and that's something that should play into the decision that we make here. The Old Greek and the Syriac is shorter, so that would, we've got a little more awkward grammatically, would lean us toward the MT, shorter would lean us toward the Old Greek and the Syriac. But I think the context gives weight to the Masoretic text, and well, what do I know? What do I mean by that? Well, Israel is used throughout the passage, so it would fit to have Israel in here. So, also, if you, we'll talk about this a little later in the analysis of the verse, but depending on how you look at this Yisrael, this usage, it actually makes a lot of sense here if it's some kind of an emotional plea or a cry out to God. So I'm going to tentatively go with the Masoretic here, but I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. So for grammar and syntax, the second clause, you can see it right there on the slide. It's kind of strange. What's going on here? So again, another funny statement from Anderson and Friedman. He says, they say this is a grammatical monstrosity, which I think is probably a little bit of a strong way to word it, but that's what they want to say. So they kind of cut the Gordian knot here by calling it a discontinuous construct phrase. So this is kind of interesting. They're basically saying that Elohai is in construct with Yisrael, and the I ending is the construct ending, and you just kind of have a verb in the middle of it. That would be tidy, but Van der Merwe is my reference grammar, and they don't have that as an option, so I'm a little bit hesitant to go with something that I'm not really sure if it has grammatical warrant. Another thing you could do here is you could look at the placement of Yisrael and say this is like an emotional emphasizer. It's like, we know you. Even Israel, we know you. So I think I would rather go that direction than just kind of a category that I've never heard about and know nothing about. But maybe when I study Hebrew more, I will change my mind. So how does this really make sense? Did Israel actually know God? And if so, what's going on here? Well, Hosea 7:7 actually says, none of them calls on me. And I believe that's the ESV. Yeah, none of them calls upon me is what the ESV says. So I thought Anderson Friedman had a great explanation of this. They said, this is not hypocrisy, although that ingredient may be present as well, but sublime, arrogant self-deception, invincible self-delusion. So in other words, it's this idea of thinking that we're the chosen people of God, we're God's people. God would never exile us. He would never cause an invading army to come, but that's just not the case. And so it's this idea of thinking that you're something you're not, especially in terms of your relationship to God. So we'll move on to verse 3 now. These verses 2 and 3, are quite short, so we don't need to spend as much time on them. Verse 3. Israel has rejected good. An enemy will pursue him. Now, It seems simple enough here, but we'll find that it's actually not that simple. So first, the verbs. We have three words here that come from verbs. And the second one is kind of really more acting like a noun, but that's why I've put it in green. So first we've got zanach, and that's a kal suffix conjugation, third masculine singular from zanach, so that's the lexical form actually. Then we've got oyev, which is a kal participle masculine singular from, I'm not sure how to say that, I'm not sure if it's ayav or eve, but regardless, aleph yod beit. And then third, we've got yerdefo, which is a kal prefix conjugation, third masculine singular, with the third common plural suffix, and that comes from radaf. So again, I would encourage you, as we go through the verbs here, keep an eye out for whether we're looking at prefix conjugation or suffix conjugation verbs. For the most part, I think it does matter in this passage. I know in previous passages it's been hard to figure out why Hosea would use one and not the other in this given place, but here it seems to be pretty straightforward for the most part. So let's move on and talk about text critical issues. So there's just one in this one. Funny story, I actually emailed Dr. Mosley about this one because I looked at that critical apparatus and I saw that little dot to the right of yerdefo, and I thought, what is that dot? I've never seen that before. Well, it turns out every single entry in the critical apparatus at the end of the page ends with a period. So I felt really dumb. But anyway, you learn something new every day. So there's a slightly different vocalization in multiple manuscripts. This seems to only really affect pronunciation, unless I'm mistaken. So it's kind of inconsequential and not worth really discussing. So in terms of grammar and syntax, we should start with this question. What's the subject and which is the verb? And excuse me, I did not word that first bullet correctly. It's supposed to say which noun is the subject and which noun is the object. So just in your mind, strike through that verb. But anyway, which one's the subject and which one's the object? To me, as a student of Hebrew, this seems fairly straightforward. It probably doesn't help that I'm coming from English, but first noun I see, I think, oh, subject. So Anderson Friedman actually supports this. They say that's the most obvious interpretation of the text. Israel has rejected good, or Israel has rejected the good. And if you recall my translation back here, that's kind of what I went with. Israel has rejected good. So Anderson Friedman actually goes and reverses what I just said. And the reason is because they say God is typically the subject of this verb. So, okay, that's an interesting point. So they're going to say, actually, because God is usually the subject of this verb, they're going to read tov as a reference to God. So the good one, i.e. God, has rejected Israel. And Tully, and Anderson Friedman, they give some evidence, but they don't argue it super forcefully. Tully actually has a great little bit in his book on page 184 and really makes a very good argument for tov being the subject and Yisrael being the object. I think it's a really good argument. I'm almost convinced. I'm not quite there yet. And the reason is because I think I just see this constant ironic reversal in Hosea where, and it has to do with Israel doing things against God and then God as a result doing things back to Israel. I see this a lot in Hosea. And so I'm going to tentatively say I think that Israel is the subject, tov is the object. And if you look at English translations, I've got a couple in front of me. Let's just do a brief survey and see what most of them go with. So this is the NIV 84. Israel has rejected what is good. The ESV 2011, Israel has spurned the good. The Holman Christian, Israel has rejected what is good. So, and I think if you look beyond this, you'll see there's pretty, even in the net translation, there's they agree with this as well. Pretty broad agreement across the English translations, but there's definitely a strong group of commentators that say this should actually be the good one has rejected Israel. It's a good argument. I'm not quite there yet, but it's a good argument. So, I mentioned this earlier. Most of the clauses in this passage are not verb initial, which is contrary to what I expected. This is the first one in the passage that's verb initial, and there's only 4 of them total. So this is something really interesting, and you can't unfortunately see it. In fact, I did not see it when I was studying the passage in my BHS, and this is unfortunate, really, that the page division comes after verse 3, because verse 3 and verse 5 are very interesting when they're seen together. So I'm actually going to drop out of the presentation real quick and show you my translation worksheet on my computer so you can see what I'm talking about, because I think it's a little bit easier actually to see here on the computer. But you can see I've got all the verbs highlighted, and you can see what I'm talking about, especially down here in these verses. Like, all the verbs are coming at the end of the clause or near the end of the clause. But in verse 3 and verse 5, you start with zanach, same word, both verses. And it really, it's just, to me, this is just too much to be a happy accident or a coincidence. I mean, I understand that we don't believe in that because we believe in the inspiration of Scriptures, but even so, it seems like there's some intentionality here to me. You got zanach Yisrael Tov, and then zanach, and so on and so forth in verse 5. So that's why I think there's something going on here. So if you look at the two verses side by side, or in the same column together, you got the same lexeme, zanach, same morphology. They're both third masculine singular, and they're both the same stem, both the same. They're both suffix conjugation, and then you got the same position in the clause, which is not a normal position in this passage. So very interesting. I would say this is at least some kind of parallelism, maybe chiasmus, and if it is seen that way, then it seems like verse 3 is Israel's rejection of God. Verse 4 is just how they rejected him, and it provides justification for God's rejection of Israel in verse 5. So that's kind of how I'm viewing verses 3, 4, and 5. So now let's look at verse 4. Translation. They have made kings, but not because of me. They have made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. They have made their silver and their gold to be idols for themselves, so that he will be destroyed. So there's a lot going on here in this verse. Let's start with the verbs. We've got 5 of them. First we have himliku, which is a hifil suffix conjugation, third common plural. And we see that it's hifil from the E between the lamed and the kaf. That's from malak. Then we have sarar, or excuse me, it's actually hesiru, which is from sarar. And that's a hifil suffix conjugation, third common plural, from sarar. And then we've got yada'ati, which is a kal suffix conjugation, first common singular, from yada. And then we have asu, which is a kal suffix conjugation, third common plural, from asa. And then last we have yikaret, which is a nifal. You can see that from the little dogish inside the kaf. It's a nifal prefix conjugation, third masculine singular, from karat. So for text critical issues on this verse, and if you're keeping track in your BHS, we've flipped the page now. Several, I didn't do the letters like I was supposed to on this slide, but several transpose this line before verse 8. And I take that several, I'm assuming that means several text critics, but I don't see any evidence for that given, so we're going to reject that one. And then point B, different pronunciation markings on multiple manuscripts. Now, this doesn't really seem to affect meaning very much, so we're going to say not important, and we'll just move on. And then for C, the critical apparatus, it says this is probably an added gloss. So we're talking about that last clause, right after the little chili pepper symbol. So there's no evidence given. They just say it's probably an added gloss. So we're going to reject that one as well, happily. So in terms of grammar and syntax, we've got 3 third common plural verbs in the first 3 clauses. But then we've got this 3ms in the final clause. So I would say the final clause here is pointing to Israel as a whole. The first 3 clauses are pointing to Israelites kind of in general, collectively. So again, this fits Hosea. We talked about this at the beginning of the passage. Now, from a clausal perspective, there's quite a bit going on here. I would say it probably makes more sense to group the fourth Masoretic clause with the third Masoretic clause and consider this a 4-clause verse instead of a 5-clause verse. And the reason for that is you read this and Lahem Atzabim, it doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense being on its own as a nominal clause, so we're just going to slap it onto the end of clause 4. So this makes it a predicate nominative linked closely with the making of the gold and silver. Again, this also matches an earlier verse in Hosea. If you think back to Hosea 2 and 8, they take the silver and the gold that God gave them and they turn it into an idol. So it's happening here in verse 4 of chapter 8 as well. Now, a valid question, how does the final clause fit? This is actually a really important syntax and clausal question. This word lama'an, and Anderson and Friedman have a very good long explanation of how this word lama'an is used. They've got like 4 or 5 different explanations that they walk through different ways that it's used. And it seems like it's hard to separate the idea of purpose out of this word. It's very tightly tied in with the way this word is used. So what does it mean then? So you might see, and let's just take a quick survey of translations and see how it's rendered. We see to their own destruction in the NIV 84. We see for their own destruction in ESV 2011. And in the Holman, we see for their own destruction. You might see that they be destroyed in some, I think that was the net maybe. So I think it's an ironic statement of the purpose for which the idols were created, or there could be another way to take it. That's how Anderson and Friedman take it. But the issue with that is that it's a singular verb. So if it's the idols, how would that make sense? Because the idols in the clause before are plural. You see that im ending in atzabim. So I'm not comfortable with that. And again, if we go back to plural verbs being referenced to generally Israelites, singular verbs generally being referenced to Israel, well then it's actually a statement about the nation of Israel. So, in other words, Hosea is saying ironically that Israel's purpose is its own destruction. That makes this a very strong and sobering statement. So Anderson Friedman pushes back against this, but I think he actually kind of overstates his case. And he basically says whenever karat is used, he doesn't say whenever, but he says karat is frequently used to talk about cutting off idols. But if you do a search of this form in the Hebrew Old Testament, you'll find that it's almost always used to talk about people or people groups being cut off. So I think it actually fits to say that this is the purpose of Israel's destruction. Now, obviously, there's no way I'm going to make an idol if I know that it's for my own destruction. So it's kind of this like ironic God's purpose in the event, but it's a very strong statement. So, interpretive question. Who are the kings and the princes? Anderson and Friedman, he kind of says this is a monarchy that's been infected by the Canaanite religions. And this is because of the close linkage between establishing kings and making idols. And again, if we think back to members of the monarchy like Ahab and Jezebel, this makes perfect sense that it would mean this. So, verse 5, translation. He has rejected your calves, Samaria. My anger is kindled at them. How long will they be unable to be free from guilt? For verbs, again, we've got this verb zanach, cal suffix conjugation, third masculine singular from zanach. Then we've got hara, which is a cal suffix conjugation, third masculine singular from hara. And then we have yuklu, which is a cal prefix conjugation, third masculine plural from yakol. So, for text critical issues, first, the critical apparatus says to read this as a first common singular. Now, let's just be sure we're looking at the right word. That's zanach. And again, we look down at the critical apparatus, 5a. Yeah, it says to look this as, read this as a first common singular. But it's not really necessary, since this could be understood as a divine passive. That doesn't actually make sense. I'm not sure why I wrote that. Forget divine passive. I don't think it's necessary. Second, the Old Greek and others understand this as an imperative. Now, this is a really interesting suggestion, and it could in fact be true. All you've got to do is change that first vowel to a shavah, and then you've got an imperative. So it would definitely resolve a curious grammatical difficulty, which we'll talk about in a second. But the overall thrust of the passage seems to me to be impending doom rather than an urgent command for repentance. This would be the only place for repentance in the passage if it was an imperative. So again, if we were to read it as an imperative, we would be saying, reject your calf, Samaria, instead of he has rejected your calf. So I'm going to lean toward the MT, but I think there's a good argument to be made there for it being an imperative based on the Old Greek. So grammar and syntax. This is, I don't know why I put divine passive, but this is what I was talking about. There's a third masculine singular verb in the first clause. Who is this referring to? Anderson and Friedman suggests that rather than read, he has rejected your calf, Samaria, we should read, he has rejected the calf of Samaria. So it's actually an interesting thought, and it would match what we see next in verse 6. But he basically makes this claim based on saying that the kaf can be used inside a construct phrase. The only evidence that he presents is Amos 8:14, and it seems to me like it's kind of a dubious example. And Van der Merwe, again, provides no such category. So, interesting thought. We're going to set it to the side. Now, from a clausal perspective, how do we understand the back and forth in the suffixes? This is something that we've seen again and again in Hosea. It seems to me that probably the simplest way to take this is that the first clause is Hosea speaking about Yahweh to Israel, but again, from a distance, kind of, as we talked about earlier. And then the second and third clauses are Yahweh speaking to Hosea about Israel. So if we go back again and think about that as we read the translation, I almost picture like Hosea saying, he's rejected your calf, Samaria, and then Yahweh saying, my anger is kindled at them. How long will they be unable to be free from guilt? Now, again, we've talked about this earlier, but there's some hints, I think, of macro structure here in this passage. There's definitely a link between verses 3 and 5 through the verb zanach. So Anderson and Friedman say this: the verb is not common. I think there's 19 uses in the Hebrew Old Testament. The verb is not common, and its use at the beginning of two verses so close together requires some connection to be found between them. And as mentioned before, I think this is some kind of a chiasm, and that would make sense of the data. And so that makes verse 4 very important. And what's verse 4? It's what they did. It's the setting up the kings and the princes, taking the silver and the gold that Yahweh gave them and making it into idols. And that provides the ground for, or the justification for, Yahweh rejecting the calf in verse 5. So what is the calf? Everybody seems to kind of agree that this is Jeroboam's calf. And if you go back and read 2 Kings 17, this is one of the most important chapters in the history of Israel. And it basically says this is why the Assyrians came to destroy the nation of Israel. And it's because of their idolatry. And it specifically mentions Jeroboam's two calves in 2 Kings. In fact, I'm just going to flip there and read that real quick, because I think that it would be valuable to keep in mind. And in fact, Anderson and Friedman, if you look in their commentary, actually calls this something like the spiritual history of Israel. So they recognize that Hosea / Yahweh is really looking back here, back in time. So 2 Kings 17:16, and they abandoned all the commandments. Interesting, we saw that word before. Of Yahweh their God, and they made for themselves metal images of two calves, and they made an Asherah and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. So the two calves are mentioned there. So if we remember correctly, the calves are in Bethel and Dan, or as Hosea calls it, Bethaven, house of iniquity. So why Samaria? Why is it the calf of Samaria, as we'll see in the next verse? Or here, why is it your calf, O Samaria, or your calf Samaria? Well, I think it's just a metonymous usage to refer to the whole of Israel. Macintosh kind of goes this way. That's on page 303. So by saying Samaria, when I mean metonymous, what I mean is he's really talking about the whole of Israel. So, verse 6. For it is from Israel, that it, I believe, is the calf. And a craftsman himself made it, but it is not God. For it will be in pieces, this calf of Samaria. We've only got two verbs here. First, we have asahu, That's a cal suffix conjugation, third masculine singular with a third masculine singular suffix from asa. And then second, we have yehya, which is a cal prefix conjugation, third masculine singular from haya. Now, for text critical issues, the critical apparatus says perhaps sons of Israel should be read here instead and understood as part of verse 5. They don't give any evidence, so we're just going to reject that and move on. Critical apparatus also asks, maybe the entire line, and again, what line are we talking about here? We're talking about the second, or really the first full line of verse 6. They're saying maybe that whole line, those two clauses, are a gloss, but no evidence given, so we'll reject that one as well. For grammar and syntax, the first clause seems to be, as we've mentioned several times now, an anaphoric reference to the calf in verse 5. So verses 5 and 6 are all about this calf. And then the pronoun in clause 2, it seems kind of out of place, that vahu. Is this a specific craftsman? That was actually the way I took it the first time I read it, and then I realized that doesn't really make any sense. You know, Anderson and Friedman kind of does that with the prophet in chapter 4, the priest in chapter 4. I don't know about that, though. So why the pronoun? So I'm kind of tentatively going with an intensive usage, and you can see that back here in the translation. A craftsman himself made it, but I might be wrong there. So if you want to maybe offer a suggestion in the comments, that would definitely be appreciated. So I'll tentatively go with an intensive usage. And then we'll move on to verse 7 and spend some time talking about verse 7, and then we'll wrap it all up. So, verse 7, translation. For they will sow in the wind, and they will reap in the whirlwind. He will have no standing grain. What sprouts will not produce flour. If it does produce it, strangers will swallow it. Now we got 5 verbs in this one. First, Yizra'u. That's a cal prefix conjugation, third masculine plural from zerah. Now again, take a look. These are all prefix conjugation verbs. So I might go back one more time to my translation worksheet after I do verse 7, and you can just see, because I've got the Hebrew text and then I've got the verbs as well. So we can see the prefix and the suffix conjugations and how they're mapped out. Second verb is yiktoru, That's a cal prefix conjugation, third masculine plural from katsar. The third verb is over in the that fourth clause, and that is yaseh, and that's a cal prefix conjugation, third masculine singular from asa. The next verb is the same, yaseh. Third cal prefix conjugation, third masculine singular from asa, and then we have yivla'uhu, and that's a cal prefix conjugation, third masculine plural from bala. Now for text critical issues, basically all of the text critical issues on this verse are an attempt to make everything kind of grammatically fit together, but none of them have any evidence. So if you look at A, it's a proposal to make it feminine. If you look at B, it's also a proposal to make it feminine. And if you look at C, it's a proposal to make it feminine and add the object suffix. So there's no evidence for any of these, so we're just going to go ahead and reject them. Now, important words. I thought, ruach. There's been some funny uses of that word in that first clause, ki ruach. So I thought maybe I should do a quick study on ruach in Hosea and see what we find. So 7 uses. 3 of them refer, at least I think 3 of them refer to the spirit of promiscuity. Definitely 4:12 and 5:4. 4:19 is in between them and it's ruach. And it's translated wind in many verses, but I really think in context it makes a lot of sense to look at it as the spirit of promiscuity. The same ruach as 4:12 and 5:4. Anyway, if we skip over 8:7, in 9:7 it's the inspired man, or maybe even the spiritual man, something like that. In 12:2 it's pretty clearly wind because it's contrasted with the east wind. And same in 13:15, it's contrasted with the east wind, so it seems like wind is the most sensible one. So, would it make sense to read it wind here? Well, probably does, because of the whirlwind that comes in the next clause, or gale, or windstorm, or whatever you want to, however you want to translate that word, sufata. Because of that, it seems like it's some kind of a literal storm of sorts, so wind would make sense. Now, for grammar and syntax, there's a stray singular in the third clause, and what's that all about? I'm going to make the argument that it refers once again to Israel as a whole. Now, for clausal analysis, this is probably the most important verse in the whole passage in terms of looking at the clauses. There's this cascading effect that you can see, and it's going to, I think, shed some light as to why I translated sow in the wind and reap in the whirlwind. But this is kind of how things cascade from one clause to the next. Sowing in the wind, reaping in the whirlwind. There's no standing grain. One would think probably because of the whirlwind. No flour from the sprouts. And even if something manages to sprout, strangers will swallow it. So, very interesting. It's like this boom, 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 boom. They all fall, in a row. So that raises the question: did I translate sow in the wind and reap in the whirlwind correctly, or would we rather go with all the English translations? Again, let's do a quick survey here. NIV 84, they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. ESV 2011, for they sow the wind and they shall reap the whirlwind. Holman, just got to flip the page. Indeed, they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. Now, this is, if you go back to the King James, it's also sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. I mean, you can see why. There's no modifiers, so if you've got a verb and a noun, the noun's probably the object, right? But there's, I think, a pretty good argument to be made that Hosea has just kind of left the modifiers out, but they're still implied there. So that's how Anderson and Friedman and Dwayne Garrett take it that way. This like adverbial or situational kind of understanding of what's going on here. And I believe it's Anderson Friedman. They basically say this is just legacy translation, where you got, it's really rhythmic. Sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. It's probably a good parenting verse, I would imagine, if you've got a rebellious teenager or something. But because of that, it's a very notable and well-known verse, and so when you try to change the way a well-known verse is translated, you get some inevitable backlash, and so this is what creates legacy translation. It's an unfortunate aspect of the fact that we tend to get emotionally attached to things. So that's not the only way to take it, though. It could be that all the English translations are translating it correctly, and if so, you've got to ascribe some kind of a metaphorical understanding here. So in point number 2, you'll see it totally takes it to be a metaphor for political alliances and their disastrous consequences. So that could be interesting. That would kind of fit Hosea in general. It would kind of fit this passage with the kings and the princes motif in verse 4. Mackintosh takes it to be a metaphor as well, but a little bit different. He says it's in sowing the wind is actually a metaphor for sowing chaos by the pursuit of idolatry. And this would actually really fit Hosea in general, and it would fit this passage quite well. So these are certainly good suggestions, and certainly maybe they're correct. So here's why I chose option 1. And again, option 1 is that it's adverbial and sow in the wind and reap in the whirlwind. it fits the cascading effect of the verse. Okay, so you've got this boom, 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 boom. It fits the content of the other clauses in the verse. Suddenly they're all agricultural, right? Sowing, reaping, no grain, not going to yield flour, and even if it does, stranger's going to eat it. So it really fits the other clauses quite well. And then it fits, I think, and just an interesting thing to think about, it really fits Hosea's repudiation of Israel's belief in Baal to provide for the agricultural needs. Because basically, what is Yahweh saying? He's saying, no, they're going to sow in the wind. This is their judgment. They're going to sow in the wind, they're going to reap in the whirlwind, and so on and so forth. So this is my argument for option 1. I think it really makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the main point of each verse. What I've tried to do is summarize each verse in kind of plain speak. So not even really, just a summary of each verse. We'll go with that. Number 1, a warning is issued to the people of Israel that they are about to be hunted down because they broke the covenant. That's the eagle image. Verse 2, Israel thinks they know God, and they will cry out to him. Verse 3, but instead they have actually rejected God, and so an enemy will pursue Israel. Verse 4, Israel enacted a wicked monarchy against God's covenant and law. They took the silver and the gold and made it into idols, unknowingly for the purpose of their own destruction. Yahweh rejects the idols in response, and his anger is directed at Israel. Yahweh asks how long until they will be innocent, and there's kind of an implication here that never. Verse 6, Yahweh asserts that the human origin of the idol asserts its powerlessness and its destiny to be destroyed. And verse 7, Yahweh decrees a chain of judgments as a result of Israel's rejection of the covenant, sowing in the wind, reaping in the whirlwind, etc. Some big ideas in the passage. Sin has consequences that are in like kind, but they kind of appear to be more dramatic than the sin itself. And you see this in a lot of the ways that God reacts to the actions of Israel in this passage. They reject the good, and good is kind of a veiled reference to God. But God says, I'm going to reject the calf, and I'm going to smash it to bits. Second, sin has it carries kind of an ironic cycle. God's discipline or punishment is in response to the sin itself. Again, this is this idea of Israel doing something and God responding. Israel doing something, God responding. Now this is, for us, I think, one of the most sobering ones to think about. There's a dangerous place to be where one thinks that he knows God, but in fact, he's deluded himself. So think about Matthew 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And what Jesus says, he says, depart from me, I never knew you. And that's just a very sobering thing to consider. Although he's not required to, God shows great patience toward his people when they sin. And he repeatedly warns them to stop sinning. We've seen this throughout Hosea, even the book itself. Why would he have spoken to Hosea? Why would he have given this oracle to the prophet if he didn't want his people to stop sinning? Another big idea, which I think is just awesome, is God will triumph over idols. They're powerless. He will win. And this is kind of lurking in the background of many, many Old Testament passages. I find myself coming back to this big idea again and again when I teach the Old Testament. But God must break this cycle of sin and punishment. He's got to be the one to fix it, because it's clear that Israel can't. That just comes up again and again in the history of Israel. So, some brief applications. Rejoice that this is not our fate, because God has revealed himself to us in Christ, and he's made his Spirit to live within us. So we have a better existence than the Israelites did, frankly, because we wake up and fall asleep each morning and each night with the Holy Spirit of God living in our hearts and testifying to us, Abba, Father. So we have something far better indeed, and it comes out in the obedience that comes from faith, as Paul says. So second application, I would say appropriate God's hatred of idolatry. It's evident in what he says about this calf. I will smash it to bits, some translations say. It's going to be destroyed. And so if you recall what Calvin said, the human heart is an idol factory. And we need to train ourselves to hate what it cranks out. And by the help of the Holy Spirit to destroy those idols. And then ask yourself if you truly know God or if you just think you do. This is a sobering thing to think about. And if you're leading or serving the church, I think we really need to teach people who are in our care that there's a difference between these two things. There's a difference between thinking you know God and not knowing Him, and actually knowing Him. The difference between knowing about Him and knowing Him. So this is a concluding thought from Anderson Friedman. This is a beautiful and sad statement. This compact curse also recapitulates the history of Yahweh's long-suffering treatment of Israel. He could have discarded the people early in their sinful career, letting the seed of His purpose perish in the promised land. But He planted them in it, and let them grow. He could have ruined the crop as He threatened, but no, He gave them grain, unrecognized and unthanked. And so it went. So the summary, then, God determined to punish the Israelites because they had broken the covenant, rejected Him, established unlawful monarchies, and turned to follow idols. Kind of depressing, but that's Hosea. We can find encouragement in other passages in the book, but I think this is the point of this passage. Thanks.